January 1944. The European sky was a frozen gray canopy of contrails and thunder. High above the Rhine, German aces circled patiently, their Bf-109s and Fu-190s slicing through the thin air, engines screaming with brutal confidence. Below them, climbing slower, heavier, almost graceless, rose the new American fighters, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Big, loud, ugly. German pilots snorted through oxygen masks and called them fliegende Milchkannen, flying milk jugs. Easy kills. They believed, but the belief didn't last. One formation turned, dove, and the air changed texture, a roar like tearing metal. 8 Browning .50 caliber guns spat fire from each wing, the sky filled with thunderclouds of tracer and smoke. The milk jug became a furnace. A German ace pulled back on his stick, too late. His fighter erupted in flame, swallowed whole in seconds. The American pilots climbed back through the debris, their radial engines howling triumph beneath the trembling clouds. What had looked slow was now unstoppable. What was mocked had turned lethal. To understand how this blunt-nosed giant shattered the Luftwaffe's arrogance, we must look back to the desperate years when the Allies searched for an answer to the enemy's grip on the European sky. By late 1942, the air war over Europe had become a test of endurance that few believed the United States could win. The 8th Air Force, newly established in Britain, had wagered everything on daylight bombing, a strategy meant to cripple Nazi industry with precision raids in full view of the enemy. The theory was bold. The reality was massacred B-17, flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators left English bases at dawn and vanished into the smoke over France and Germany. When they returned, their formations were torn apart, wings sheared, gun positions shredded by cannon fire. The Luftwaffe's fighters ruled the upper altitudes. They attacked in disciplined packs of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, diving straight through the bomber boxes, scattering machine gun shells and fragments of men across the clouds. The bomber crews fought bravely, but courage couldn't outfly mathematics. At 20,000 feet, escort fighters like the P-38 Lightning and the early model P-47 Thunderbolt couldn't stay with them beyond the French coast. Out over enemy territory, the bombers were alone. Losses climbed so high that some crews joked grimly that they were flying to Berlin on a one-way ticket. Back in the United States, design engineer Alexander Kartveli at Republic Aviation faced a paradox. His aircraft, the P-47, was fast on paper but enormous in person. A brute built around the heaviest radial engine ever mounted on a single-seat fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. It produced hellish torque and noise and made the plane look like a flying oil drum. Skeptics called it too heavy to maneuver, too bulky for dogfighting. Even Allied pilots joked that if you wanted to eject, you had to unscrew the plane from around you. Yet the U.S. Army Air Forces ordered it into combat. It was powerful, rugged, and could dive faster than any German plane. The trick was learning how to use it. When the first units arrived in England in spring 1943, their range barely reached Belgium. Pilots loved its firepower, 8 .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, but they hated its appetite for fuel. German aces laughed. They preferred their FW-190A series with light frames, blistering climb, and cannon punch. Luftwaffe briefings described the P-47 as slow, clumsy, and easily caught in a vertical fight. They were half right. In a climb, the Thunderbolt suffered, but in a dive, it became unstoppable. U.S. instructors drilled a new tactic: boom and zoom, strike fast from altitude, unload every gun, and escape downward where its radial engine and weight protected it. Even so, early missions offered mixed results. P-47 squadrons fought bravely over France and the Low Countries, but could not prevent the slaughter of unescorted bombers deep inside Germany. At Regensburg and Schweinfurt, hundreds of B-17s vanished in plumes of debris. Something had to change. Back at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, engineers focused on the fighter's endurance. New fuel plumbing allowed 2 external tanks to hang beneath the wings like metal lungs. With drop tanks, a P-47 could finally follow the bombers nearly to central Germany. Mechanics tinkered non-stop, adjusting carburetors for high-altitude performance and polishing prop blades to squeeze every mile. Meanwhile, the pilots learned character. The Thunderbolt punished mistakes but saved lives. It could take unbelievable punishment, Wings peppered, fuselage torn, hydraulics out, and still bring its pilot home. Stories spread fast through the 8th Air Force of fighters returning with half their tails missing, oil pressure gone and smoke filling the cockpit. When other planes burned, the jug just grumbled. German intelligence officers on the Channel coast began noticing a worrying pattern. Intercept reports mentioned fewer Thunderbolts lost despite heavy damage. Recon photos showed new American fighter fields creeping eastward across England. The Luftwaffe's dominance was being pierced inch by bloody inch. Still, to many inside Hitler's air arm, contempt came easier than caution. They dismissed the Thunderbolt as brute force, incapable of artistry or finesse. In Luftwaffe briefings, the word used was plump, the polite translation of an insult. The Americans, they said, were trading skill for mass production. That judgment would prove fatal. For as the new year dawned in 1944, unknown to most pilots on either side, those same plump machines were about to bridge the gap of distance that had doomed so many before them. And with it, the balance of the air war would shift forever. Early 1944 brought the Allies to a crossroads in the air campaign. By then, America's industrial surge was in full roar. Aircraft factories from New York to California turning out fighters faster than the front could absorb them. The P-47 Thunderbolt ranked among the most expensive single-seat aircraft ever built, but it was also one of the toughest. That investment was about to pay dividends measured not in dollars, but in altitude and dominance. In January, the 8th Air Force restructured its offensive plan. Bombers would strike deeper: Frankfurt, Hanover, Leipzig, and Berlin itself. To survive those missions, they would need protection all the way to target and back. On snowy English airfields, squadrons practiced refueling, arming, and launching Thunderbolts every few minutes. Mechanics wrapped engines against the cold. Ground crews brushed rime off wings. And pilots studied new fuel management charts listing each gallon like a prayer. The addition of 150-gallon drop tanks transformed the P-47 from tactical shield to strategic sword. Each silver pod meant another hour of range. Major General Ira Eaker's headquarters called it operational depth equal to the continent. The Luftwaffe soon faced something it had never confronted: armed American fighters escorting bombers across Germany's very core. German intelligence at Jagdgeschwader 26 noted the change immediately. Enemy fighter, previously disengaging near coast, now follows bombers inland, engagements frequent up to 300 kilometers within Reich. The report's closing line carried unease. The new heavy fighter appears indestructible. In truth, the Thunderbolt's invincibility grew as much from discipline as design. Pilots abandoned romantic notions of dogfighting and instead applied calculus: dive angle, energy retention, closing speed. These became the vocabulary of aerial survival. Every pilot trained to hit once and vanish. Fewer showdowns, more results. Meanwhile, German high command struggled to fill its own ranks. The reserves that once fed the Luftwaffe's elite squadrons had been drained by years of combat. Replacements arrived half-trained, some barely familiar with their aircraft. Veterans like Adolf Galland and Egon Mayer understood the peril. "Our enemy grows stronger while we measure fuel by drops," Mayer lamented before his fatal sortie in March 1944. The psychological shift was visible in simple gestures. German crews who once posed beside sleek FW-190s now photographed themselves in fatigue caps tanking makeshift fuel blends. At altitude, their aircraft coughed, starved of octane. American Thunderbolts, by contrast, roared on high-grade gasoline refined by a continent's industry. Still, arrogance dies hard. Intelligence summaries read to German pilots mocked the P-47 as lumbering, inelegant, fit only for ground attack. The Luftwaffe schools kept teaching vertical climbing duels, techniques fatal against an opponent that preferred velocity over maneuver. Instructors warned their cadets not to be caught in extended dives with the heavy American plane. But few listened until experience silenced theory. Then came the mission reports that broke the illusion. On February 20th, the first day of Big Week, Thunderbolts from the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups escorted hundreds of B-17s through a storm of flak to Leipzig. German interceptors dove in sure of easy kills. 10 minutes later, 14 Luftwaffe fighters were burning in the snow. Witnesses described the shock among survivors. The slow American aircraft had entered dives so steep, that their German pursuers broke formation rather than follow. The truth raced through the Luftwaffe. Below 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolt could dive faster than physics should allow. Its weight and drag made it a projectile. Its radial engine resisted catastrophic overspeed. Pilots began calling it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. The name stuck. By spring, the 8th Air Force had redefined escort warfare. Thunderbolts flew top cover, Mustangs stretched the long distance beyond, and P-38s filled gaps along the flanks. Together, they dismantled the myth of the invincible Jagdwaffe. German aces found themselves outnumbered, outclimbed, and finally outmaneuvered by sheer endurance. Inside the command posts of Germany's air defense system, officers warned Berlin that the enemy now commands the approach to every industrial target. The message reached Hitler himself, who ordered new aircraft built, the Me-262 jet, far too late to change the outcome. What once sounded like thunder in the distance was now constant. American engines beating overhead, day after day, factory after factory, and soon those same engines would descend into battle against Germany's finest fighter wings, where the truth about the slow Thunderbolt would explode in the skies over Central Europe. The heart of the P-47, Thunderbolt was not grace but endurance. Its backbone, a heavy steel frame around the monstrous Pratt & Whitney R-2800, formed a core so strong it doubled as armor. The radial engine didn't rely on delicate liquid cooling. It could take hits that would cripple inline engines like those in the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf. One bullet into a Merlin coolant line meant evacuation. 10 through a double Wasp cylinders often meant nothing at all. Under the skin, everything was over-engineered. Hydraulic lines wrapped behind armor plate. Self-sealing fuel tanks nested inside the fuselage. Thick wings carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns, 4 on each side. A wall of fire that could rip through an aircraft in seconds. At more than 8 tons fully loaded, the Thunderbolt looked like a brawler in a field of dancers. But it turned that mass into momentum. German engineers first laughed at its bulk. Then reports reached factories back home. Wrecks of Bf-109s perforated by 50 cal rounds, pilots with no time to bail out. Radar plots showed American fighters ending their dives near terminal velocity and climbing away unharmed. Investigators realized the P-47's structure endured stresses no German machine could match. In an era obsessed with speed, the Thunderbolt's advantage was stamina. Its weight created devastating kinetic energy. Its broad wings buffered turns. Its turbo supercharger breathed efficiently above 30,000 feet. You could light a cigarette in a thunderstorm, one pilot said, and she'd bring you home glowing. The German aces who once dismissed it now dreaded the hollow, throaty grumble of that twin-wheeled giant overhead. It wasn't pretty, but every rattle carried intent. At the start of 1943, American tactics were defensive. Thunderbolts flew close to bomber formations, reacting to attacks. By 1944, experience had burned away hesitation. They became predators. Training schools in England and Debden taught the energy fight. Don't turn, dive. Don't linger, climb. The P-47's speed in a dive approached 525 miles per hour, faster than any Bf-109G variant could follow without structural failure. German fighters rose to intercept. The Americans dropped like weights, fired short bursts, and used momentum to zoom back upward. Pilots described the sensation as riding artillery. They calculated attack vectors by stopwatch. Fire 2 seconds, break 30 degrees, roll right, dive again. Radio brevity codes shortened to single syllables. Splash, break, clear. Discipline replaced improvisation. Escort philosophy evolved too. Rather than hovering directly above bombers, the Thunderbolt spread out into layered stacks extending miles high. Each layer covered the other. Luftwaffe formations diving on bombers now found a screen of angry metal between them and their prey. Allied gunners spoke of it as armor in the sky. Tactics extended beyond combat. Ground crews repainted upper surfaces in mottled camouflage to trick interceptors, blending against overcast. Fighters flew staggered departure times for deception, creating illusion of endless reinforcements. Intelligence intercepts revealed German controllers reporting dozens of squadrons, often just 12 aircraft arriving in rotation. The psychological toll outweighed the physical. Enemy pilots, once certain of superiority, hesitated to dive through bomber streams. Each hesitation gave the Thunderbolts their moment. They came roaring out of sun glare, guns flashing, breaking attack lines before they ever reached formation. Mustang pilots would later claim the headlines, but those months belonged to the Jug. It rewrote the rules of perseverance in air warfare, proving that total readiness defeated individual brilliance. Over Europe's frozen plains, speed meant seconds. Endurance meant survival, and within that endurance lived the human story. The young men who harnessed brute machinery, who found faith in its roar and courage in its weight. Their bond with the Jug transcended the cockpit. The pilots of the P-47 Thunderbolt were ordinary men, transformed by an extraordinary machine. Most were in their early 20s, drawn from towns across America, farm boys from Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, college athletes from Ohio. When they climbed into the Jug's vast cockpit, they confronted not elegance but mass. Flight manual wedged under one thigh, oxygen hose snaking past shoulder straps, control stick vibrating like a live thing. Francis Gaby Gabreski, son of Polish immigrants, became the symbol of American adaptability. He studied German tactics obsessively, matching arrogance with knowledge. "If they think we're clumsy," he told his men, "make sure we hit them like a hammer." In mid-1944, Gabreski downed 28 enemy aircraft, most while escorting bombers under crushing fatigue. His victories came not from speed but anticipation, knowing the enemy's dive angle before they moved. Then there was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, who turned survival into legend. Over France, he was ambushed by 4 FW-190s. Cannon shells punctured his wings, set his cockpit ablaze, shattered his armored glass, but the Jug refused to die. Johnson cut power, prayed for altitude, and waited for the Germans to finish him. When one circled to deliver the final burst, Johnson fired back with his remaining guns and drove the attacker off. He landed crippled but alive. His P-47 counted 200 holes and still taxied to refuel. Stories like that carried across every base, convincing young pilots that their machine could endure anything they could. Inside dusty Quonset huts, bunks lined with survival kits, photographs from home, and tins of coffee, these men lived the monotony between missions as intensely as the missions themselves. They drew cartoons of Luftwaffe aces on chalkboards, logged sorties with fading pencils, then walked into hangars vibrating with engine tests. The sound was deafening, the smell of fuel comforting. Many confessed years later that they slept only under that noise. They called themselves merely escorts, but they knew each sortie mattered to thousands of bomber crews. Even one Thunderbolt overhead could turn terror into confidence. When asked after the war what he remembered most, a B-17 pilot answered simply, "The first time I saw a Jug next to my window, I believed we'd make it home." German pilots prided themselves on artistry in flight. They saw air combat as skill refined by duels, ace against ace. The arrival of the Thunderbolt disrupted that romance. To many it seemed unrefined, industrial, lacking grace. Yet confronting it in combat erased illusions within minutes. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 and JG-11 recorded astonishment. American fighters that did not fall after 20 hits and continued offensive action though trailing smoke. Technical officers examining wrecks discovered armored firewalls 3 inches thick, ammunition belts seemingly endless, and persistence bordering on absurd. One squadron leader wrote, "It is not a fighter, it is artillery." Interrogations of downed American pilots deepened the disbelief. Germans expected arrogance and found method instead. These men spoke about fuel charts, dive angles, and teamwork, not heroics. The contrast gnawed at Luftwaffe morale. Ace Hans-Ulrich Rudel later admitted privately, "We fought individuals. They built machines to fight for them." By mid-1944, Luftwaffe bulletins altered tone from mockery to caution. Training manuals warned new pilots, "Do not engage Thunderbolt in dive pursuit. Avoid tail chase. Its defensive fire is overpowering." Even propaganda radio avoided naming the aircraft. Euphemisms like heavy American fighter replaced the word Thunderbolt. Captured correspondence shows grudging respect growing among surviving Luftwaffe veterans. One letter found in a destroyed airfield near Aachen read, "They said it was slow until it killed half my staffel." For the first time, raw industrial strength had humbled the chivalry of individual combat. In the wider war room of history, the Thunderbolt represented more than one aircraft. It embodied the industrial philosophy of the United States, efficiency, mass production, mechanical reliability, and relentless modification. Every shell casing ejected from a Jugs gun reflected a supply chain stretching from Illinois steel mills to Alabama assembly lines. For America, air power was not charisma. It was logistics turned into thunder. The Germans had honed superiority through selective excellence. The Americans pursued ubiquity. The P-47 was proof that quantity built to quality could overwhelm even the finest opposition. Its design philosophy echoed the country that made it: large, loud, practical, and impossible to ignore. Morally, the Thunderbolt also carried symbolism. Pilots who flew it called it honest. It didn't pretend grace. It forgave mistakes. It shielded the inexperienced. In skies filled with smoke and anti-aircraft bursts, that mattered more than elegance. Strategically, the aircraft bridged the shift from defensive escort to offensive domination. Once the Luftwaffe's fastest wings faltered, Jugs pierced deeper, strafing rail yards, fuel convoys, and troop columns, crippling the supply arteries of Hitler's collapsing front. A design once mocked as too heavy became the hammer that broke Germany's mobility. By year's end 1944, nothing that moved by daylight inside German territory was safe. And from that unrelenting momentum rose a new phase of the air war. The decisive combats of spring 1944, when arrogance met endurance head-on over the heart of Europe. April 8, 1944. Over central Germany, the air vibrated with the mechanical heartbeat of two empires colliding. The bomber streams had stretched for miles, sunlight glinting off the aluminum skin of hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators as they droned toward their targets at Oschersleben and Halberstadt. Below and above them waited the hunters of the Luftwaffe, veterans from Jagdgeschwader 11 and 26 who had shattered earlier American raids and were confident they would do so again. They already knew the escort call sign: Jug Flight. To them it meant clumsy American escorts, too slow, too distant, easy to evade. But that morning the sky held a different rhythm. Wider formations, tighter discipline, higher altitude. The Thunderbolts had changed since winter. At 20,000 feet, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson's unit climbed into position above the bomber stream. Static filled the radios. Snaps of coded chatter, altitude calls, brief bursts of calm voices braced for chaos. At 10:06, radar pickets along Germany's northern coast reported contact. Enemy squadrons taking off from Bunstorf, Gütersloh, and Venlo. In the glass nose of a B-17, an observer saw them first, tiny specks blooming from the haze ahead. Moments later, flak bursts peppered the horizon, black puffs marking invisible range. The Luftwaffe's head-on attack pattern formed, 30 Mi-109s in descending waves, cannon noses flashing. The Thunderbolts rolled inverted. Dive angle 45 degrees, 8 guns each, 10 rounds per second. The first streak of tracers crossed the sky like bright stitching through gray cloth. Johnson's flight caught the lead German pack off guard. The Jug's heavy dive carried it through the melee. Two Focke-Wulfs disintegrated almost instantly, one sheared in half, the other trailing fire into the clouds. But there was no time to count. More interceptors came from above, and the air exploded into frantic geometry. Observers later wrote that the sound was a continuous growl, not battle, but thunder rolling through the upper atmosphere. The Mustangs had not yet arrived. The Thunderbolts bore the brunt. Captain Walker, Bud Mahurin, spotted a Mi-109 climbing for his tail. He dropped flaps, feigned slow, then punched throttle. The Jug hurtled forward like a thrown anvil. The German overshot, trapped in the crosshairs. 2-second burst, and the canopy blew apart. Mahurin pulled upward through the shrapnel and saw another enemy spiraling below him, smoke gouging the sky like charcoal. On the ground below, German villagers watched contrails carving white scars overhead. Children counted the falling parachutes. Farmers shielded eyes against radiant debris. They didn't know the pattern unfolding above marked the breaking of their nation's last defense. By noon, radio circuits blared with fragments of victory calls. Splash 1, 2 confirmed. Fuel half. The American bombers had reached their target zones with minimal harassment. The factories that built Focke-Wulfs burned unseen behind the clouds. When the surviving German pilots limped home, control officers recorded bewildered reports. Thunderbolts attacking from directly above at unheard-of altitudes. diving faster than the enemy could follow, shrugging off devastating hits. Those who struck them described sparks bouncing from armor plating as if from steel. This battle, one of several during the Big Week offensive, marked an irreversible inflection. For the first time, Luftwaffe intercepts failed to disperse the bomber formations. At Oschersleben, only scattered shells reached the targets. At Gardelegen, half the interceptors never came back. American losses fell sharply. Among the debriefing papers filed that night was a note from Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. Their arrogance is broken. The Jug stands where the B-17 once stood, as fortress in the air. Those words captured the transformation of the campaign. The Thunderbolt was no longer a defensive escort but a weapon of shock. German aces who had once hunted across open skies now faced an opponent they could neither outclimb nor outdive. At sector headquarters in Belgium, intelligence officers pinned maps with colored string showing engagements that day. The pattern resembled widening circles over German airspace, an expanding storm driven by radial engines. The tone and after-action notes shifted from loss count to capability. Effective to target zone. Escort coverage continuous. Each line of confirmation signified something larger, the first stirrings of Allied air supremacy. But mastery must still be proven in repetition. Over the months that followed, the heavy thunder of those radial engines would return again and again, erasing the remainder of Germany's aerial might until silence, not smoke, became evidence of victory. The weeks after Oschersleben rewrote the vocabulary of the air war. Every dawn, the same ritual. Engines coughing to life on English airfields, frost melting from propeller blades and crews standing back as waves of P-47 Thunderbolts ripped into the gray. Their mission orders were simple now: sweep, escort, destroy. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost the luxury of initiative. German radar outposts along the coast reported American formations almost daily, measurements so constant they resembled timetables. Fighter regiments that once launched intercepts in perfect pyramids began taking off piecemeal, fuel siphoned into whichever aircraft still had serviceable engines. The difference was visible even from the ground. Civilians in Germany watched with dread as silver thunderheads of contrails drifted overhead, moving too high, too steady, too numerous to stop. Newspaper propaganda still claimed hundreds of enemy planes downed, but factory workers knew better. The raids came again next morning, and the next. Inside the shattered ranks of the Luftwaffe, surviving veterans spoke of terror, not defeat. A creeping realization that the fight had slipped beyond human control. Their sleek fighters, masterpieces of design now disintegrated under brute American firepower. The distinctive sound of 850 caliber guns rattling in chorus became instant warning. When I heard it, one German pilot recalled, I knew the war was lost. Tactically, the Americans pressed this edge. The Thunderbolts learned to dive in synchronized waves, each attack coordinated by stopwatch. At altitude, they looked like spears thrown from the sun, sunlight flashing on wingtips, vapor trails twisting into smoke. On every pass, they left another hole in the Luftwaffe's order of battle. June 1944 turned endurance into contagion. In those same weeks that Allied troops broke through Normandy's beaches, Thunderbolts eliminated German transport corridors behind the front. Trains, fuel depots, convoys, nothing moved by daylight. A mission log from the 9th Air Force on June 10th lists in cold bureaucratic ink. Enemy rolling stock destroyed, 72. Aircraft destroyed on ground, 58. What had begun as escort warfare evolved into systematic paralysis. German units couldn't refuel, couldn't reposition, couldn't breathe. The Jug had become a weapon of logistics, carving arteries instead of chasing hearts. For pilots like Gabreski and Mahurin, each sortie blended exhaustion with momentum. Success tasted like expended ammunition and the smell of cordite in the cockpit. Descriptions in diaries shifted from fear to inevitability, men no longer asking whether they'd survive, but how many of the enemy would. German aces who reached the combat zones found skies already stripped. In July, a reconnaissance flight by JG-301 over Kassel reported, no visibility of friendly aircraft. Encountered 15 Thunderbolts at altitude. 3 lost immediately. That same month, long-range strikes reached Berlin's outskirts. The psychological effect exceeded destruction itself. By August 1944, Luftwaffe Command acknowledged catastrophe in memoranda to Hitler's staff. Our fighter arm, one blunt report read, is no longer capable of defending Germany's industrial heartland. Losses were accelerating, fuel nearly gone, training hours slashed to an average of 8 per new pilot, and still, the Thunderbolts came. They roared over a collapsing empire, strafing airfields where grounded Messerschmitts burned like torches across concrete. At Münster, a survivor recalled walking among rows of smoldering aircraft, counting 70 wrecks by noon. The thunder was permanent, he said. It never left. In the power vacuum of the Luftwaffe's collapse, the P-51 Mustang arrived to claim final headlines. Sleeker, faster, with longer legs, it would escort every bomber to Berlin and beyond. Yet even as the spotlight shifted, the foundation remained the Jug's legacy. The Thunderbolt had fought the critical months that broke Germany's wings. The newer designs flew through the airspace it had won. In October, Colonel Zemke wrote home that his group had destroyed more than 1,000 enemy fighters. We did not win by speed, he concluded. We won by staying when they left. Those words summarized the moral architecture of the turning point: endurance as strategy, persistence as weapon. When winter returned, Luftwaffe squadrons were shadows of their former selves. Night raids replaced daylight sorties, their pilots aged and afraid, their engines cold from lack of fuel. American airmen soaring above the snow knew that if the war in Europe had tipped anywhere, it was here, in the altitude where arrogance melted and persistence survived. The European sky was no longer contested, it was occupied. And from that dominance, the Americans would soon translate air mastery into ground victory, a chain of events that would bring the Thunderbolt home to new duties during and after D-Day, when the heavy fighter turned from shield to hammer against the retreating German war machine. Summer 1944. The thunder that had protected bombers now rolled lower, closer to the ground, following the Allied armies as they crawled out of Normandy. With the beaches secured and France fractured into pockets of retreating German divisions, the P-47 Thunderbolt began a new career: ground attack. No aircraft was better suited for it. Its radial engine shrugged off small arms fire. Its thick wings carried bombs, rockets, and ammunition heavier than its designers had ever anticipated. The Thunderbolt that once cut clouds at 20,000 feet now roared through treetop level, spitting fire against steel columns and convoys. Pilots joked that they were no longer escorts but flying tanks. The Germans stopped laughing. From August through December, the 9th Air Force's Thunderbolt groups ranged the front in relentless cycles: refuel, reload, and dive again. Each squadron marked targets with flares and radioed coordinates to columns of Shermans below. Morning haze became lawless thunderclaps of explosions. By afternoon, the skies filled with drifting smoke from shattered rail yards, bridges, ammunition depots. In shattered villages, German soldiers described the fear of low-flying Jugs as worse than artillery. They tear the sky itself, one wrote in his diary. You hear them once and you dive forever. Civilians hiding in cellars recognized them by their sound, a deep, rhythmic pulse that preceded the strike by seconds. Statistics traced the scale of destruction. In the 3 months after D-Day, Thunderbolts destroyed more than 6,000 railroad cars and nearly 900 locomotives. Hundreds of vehicles abandoned on the roads of France were not victims of tank fire, but 50 cal bullets punching through radiators. Eisenhower's intelligence officers called the P-47 the most efficient armed reconnaissance tool in theater. The aircraft's shift from sky, duelist to battlefield support symbolized the Allied war's transformation. Strategic bombing had broken Germany's industry. The Thunderbolt now broke its mobility, while Mustangs prowled higher altitudes hunting the last defenders. The Jugs dismantled what remained of the Wehrmacht's backbone, its logistics chain. At base airfields stretching from Normandy to Belgium, the cost of that success was visible. Crews refueling fighters wore sleeveless shirts black with soot. Pilots stumbled from cockpits, ears ringing, the smell of exhaust clinging to every thread of cloth. Between takeoffs, they shared brief silence. Coffee boiled over portable stoves. Cigarettes passed around cracked metal mugs. Their talk was simple: fuel, weather, targets. The war beyond their mission ceased to exist. German reports labeled the P-47 Terrorflieger, Terror Flyer, a title the pilots never used but privately understood. They knew the sound of their guns on a train yard meant men running for their lives. Within that grim arithmetic lay acceptance. They were dismantling a war machine, piece by piece until surrender was inevitable. By autumn, Allied armor had crossed the Seine. American fighter bombers shadowed them, turning every German retreat into a gauntlet. From above, the view was geological, rivers of smoke carving across Europe's plains. The offensive pressed east toward borders that seemed unreachable a year before. In the same skies where Luftwaffe aces once mocked the slow Thunderbolt, there were now only contrails of Allied formations returning to base. For the average jug pilot, victory was measured not by numbers killed or machines destroyed, but by repetition, each mission flown, each bomber escorted, each friend still alive on the landing strip at dusk. The mighty radial engines later idled in evening light, metallic ticking as they cooled. Crews leaned on propeller blades and counted the silhouettes, returning against a soot-colored sky. What had started as an ugly outsider had become the loud heartbeat of Allied air power, and while the front moved east toward the Rhine, the Thunderbolt service was not done. Its pilots, hardened by years above the clouds, would carry the war to Germany's final heartlands, until surrender replaced smoke as the horizon's color. By the winter of 1945, the sky over Germany no longer sounded like battle. It sounded like occupation. Dortmund, Cologne, and Kassel lay beneath a constant hum of Allied aircraft. Occasionally, that deep, throaty growl of radial engines rolled across empty airfields. The unmistakable voice of the P-47 Thunderbolt finishing its work. The Luftwaffe existed only in fragments. Where once thousands of Bf-109s and Fw-190s launched daily, now a few dozen took off each month, often running out of fuel before meeting the enemy. Radar stations that had guided intercepts were rubble. Command bunkers communicated with squadrons that no longer answered. In that vacuum of silence, the Thunderbolt ruled alone. Its final missions were less ferocious but more systematic. Pilots struck columns of refugees, rail lines, and last-ditch armored movements around the Ruhr pocket. Cruel necessity to end a relentless war. They knew victory was days away, yet losses still came from flak and mechanical failure. For every German factory flattened, another American name vanished from the morning roll call. On the ground, surrendered German soldiers often expressed astonishment when they saw the aircraft up close. Many murmured that it was larger than remembered, its metal scarred but intact from countless sorties. One Wehrmacht mechanic reportedly touched the wing as if it were an artifact, whispering, "We could never have built this." That sentiment echoed the truth. Germany's craftsmanship had met America's industry and lost. When peace finally came, the Thunderbolt's mission shifted again. The same aircraft that had broken Europe's defenses now flew mercy flights, delivering supplies to liberated camps and reconnaissance over smoldering cities. Pilots accustomed to weapons loads now dropped food, blankets, and chocolate bars. The sound that once meant death became a symbol of rescue. For the engineers at Republic Aviation, it was confirmation of their improbable vision. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 15,000 P-47s were built, a triumph of mass production and refinement. Each one improved upon its predecessor, each a link in the chain of Allied victory. Post-war evaluations concluded it had destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands on the ground. Allied bomber losses fell by 2/3 after its debut. German records, once meticulous, end abruptly in spring 1945. The Reich's last fighter groups recorded no victories, only statistics of ruin. It was said that by April, German pilots learned to dive not at the bombers but away from the American fighters shadowing them. The term Thunderbolt syndrome appeared in internal memos, a shorthand for panic. Meanwhile, back in America, air bases filled with returning pilots who had trouble hearing silence. They missed the vibration under their boots. They wrote memoirs about noise, shock waves, and the strange comfort of a cockpit that had saved them. Many would fly again, in Korea, where the last versions of the Thunderbolt, redesignated the F-47, strafed communist convoys much as they had German ones. Even in the jet age, its durability kept it relevant. For those who had fought against it, respect replaced scorn. Captured Luftwaffe officers during interrogation sessions in 1946 consistently named the P-47 as the aircraft they least wanted to encounter. One admitted, It was like fighting a bulldozer in the clouds. Another simply said, "We could outturn it but never outlast it." Post-war historians would call the Thunderbolt the unsung hero of Europe's liberation, overshadowed by the Mustang's sleek beauty and range. Yet every map of Allied advance printed that summer owed part of its outline to the jug-shaped machine that had paved the corridors through which the bombers flew and the armies marched, on dormant airstrips from Belgium to Bavaria. Rows of P-47s sat abandoned, their propellers tied down by rope, paint dulled by frost. Mechanics drained their fuel, cleaned the guns one last time, and covered the canopies with tarpaulins. Some were scrapped, others sent overseas to new allies. The engines that once shook the earth went quiet, but silence did not erase legacy. Every veteran who watched one disappear into a museum hangar knew that inside that vast fuselage slept the spirit of those years. Speed in the dive, strength in the climb, thunder without apology. When the war ended, the Germans stood among ruins built by their own ambition. The Americans stood on runways of black volcanic sand and concrete, remembering how laughter in enemy briefings had turned to awe. Out of that contrast rose a lesson written in steel, one the world would never forget. When the smoke finally drifted from Europe's skies, a strange silence followed. It was the quiet after years defined by engines, by the deep thunder of a machine built not to charm but to endure. The P-47 Thunderbolt had entered war mocked as ungainly, slow, too heavy for a dogfight. It left it as proof that strength, when partnered with discipline and resolve, can outlast any notion of superiority. In the storm of aerial warfare, the Thunderbolt represented something more profound than speed or firepower. It reflected the nation that built it, pragmatic, impatient with ornament, obsessed with reliability. Its pilots didn't chase glory. They measured victory, and survivors returned home. Their aircraft carried them through the worst storms man could invent, and often brought them back when nothing else could. For the German aces who once smirked at the milk jug, the lesson came too late. They discovered that progress doesn't always glide. Sometimes it thunders. The jug's roar signaled a shift in the nature of modern war, from valor defined by duels to victory defined by endurance and industry. Decades later, the few that remain gleam in museums, polished smooth, their wings reflecting light like old mirrors. When mechanics turn their propellers and the radial engine rumbles awake, visitors pause instinctively. The ground trembles a little and the past breathes again. It is not the sound of triumph alone. It is the echo of persistence, of a machine that refused fragility, of men who outflew fear itself, of a lesson forged in the balance between muscle and mathematics. Across the silence of post-war fields, history still hears that pulse. The jug's legacy is not just the bullet holes it survived, or the enemies it destroyed, but the truth it proved, that resilience has a voice, and sometimes it sounds like thunder rolling across a continent waiting to be free. Like the documentary? Hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real WW2 stories every day.